while we are waiting to have something on the screen that looks like a lecture, I want to tell you that next Thursday, for those of you who are taking the colloquium on CS390, next Thursday is the end of the road. Well, you can still attend the other events, but not the end of the road is kind of a interesting twist to it, because the speaker is Jacob Applebaum, and he's going to talk about anonymity and about privacy, all of which
it's
still a way for him because the government has been.
So he's actually going to be here. He's not wrapped up in the government.
Well, unless he's arrested, he's going to be here. Now, today I have the distinct pleasure of introducing you to Jason Shankel, who is probably the most knowledgeable person about computer games on the planet. You mention any computer game you play, he probably knows it better than you do. And he worked on The Sims and SimCity and all of those. And today he's going to lecture us about...
Does it get my thing up? Yes. About prototyping.
Anyway, he's going to tell us about prototyping.
You're going to go through the DVD instead?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
So,
Sure. There it is.
Cool. Yeah, for some reason it didn't connect to my
You'd be surprised with our network.
So let's welcome Jason.
Okay, I think I'll just do it this way. This will be fine. So yes, my name is Jason Shankel. I work at the Stupid Fun Club, which is Will Wright, the developer of Spore's creative think tank in Emeryville, California. This here is my website, and I'm here today to discuss the process of prototyping video games, in particular the prototyping process that we went through on the development of Spore. So how many people here are familiar with Spore, have seen it? And like, okay, good. So I'm not speaking into a void. That's great. First, my disclaimer here. Everything you hear from me here today is my opinion alone. It doesn't necessarily reflect the viewpoint of the Stupid Fun Club or Electronic Arts. And if EA comes and tells you a different story about Spore, they're telling the truth and I'm lying. So let's get on to my lies. Here we go. So Spore, for those of you familiar with it, is a kind of a sprawling character generation game based upon evolution and the idea of evolving a character from a small microbe living in a pool up through being a complex animal, living in a tribal society, living in an industrial society, and then ultimately living in a galactic society. And when we set out to create Spore, the voyage of creating Spore was about 8 years. We started with this very basic idea that we wanted to portray the increasing complexity of life in the game and have the player go through the experience of having to make life or death decisions on larger and larger scales, and to demonstrate how the scales of life from the galaxy down to the tide pool are and the ways in which they're similar and the ways in which they are different, and the ways in which the legacy of your evolutionary heritage affects your ability to be a technological society and things like that. So we had all these very lofty ideas. And this is, kind of an arrangement of the final product that we came up with. And so what I'm going to talk to you today about is the process that we went through in prototyping and in developing the ideas that eventually became the game. And the ideas that I want to get across here is that the process of prototyping, especially in game development, but in any kind of software product development, is becoming more and more crucial to developing successful products or for implementing a product vision that you want to create, because software systems have become so incredibly complicated in recent years. And that complication has made it pretty much impossible for us to just sort of set down the old waterfall model, sit down, design, decide what you're going to do, write it down, submit it to an engineering team, have them build it, review it, and then go through the cycle again until you get it. That process goes on forever and ever and ever and ever. And if you don't have an effective prototyping strategy, you have very little chance of actually either doing anything new and interesting or succeeding in any way. Okay, so so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take you through some of the prototypes that have been made available on the EA website. If you go to, if you just Google for Spore and Spore prototypes, they made a series of our early prototypes available for download and for play. And those are the prototypes that I've developed, that I worked on. Everything I'm going to show you today is stuff that I personally built. There are other ones that other developers built that are available on that site. And they represent the kind of the arc through which we got to this game. So we started from a very hard science point of view. We had this idea that we wanted to create a simulation of a realistic astrobiological environment where life would spread throughout the galaxy in a way that's consistent with our best theories. And the very first prototype we developed was something called Particle Man. Now, Particle Man is an n-body gravitational simulator that simulates the collapse of a system of particles that are gravitationally attracted to each other. Okay, and because gravitational attraction is an order n squared problem, you can see that rapidly when you start introducing more and more particles, 800, 1,000, we were at one point wanting to simulate 5,000 or 10,000 particles, the computation time just gets completely out of hand. And so we have to arrange our particles, it's a little bit hard to see here, but into a hierarchical octree, which will give us an order n log n algorithm for attracting a group of particles. And basically what it says here is if I'm a particle and you're across the room, there's like 5 of you over there, I don't want to calculate my gravitational attraction to each of you because you're all basically in the same position. What I want to do is clump you together into one particle and make that one calculation. But if I'm right here and it's all you guys, right, then I do want to treat you each individually because obviously the angles between us are much more different. That's basically what this octree does. Now I have a little movie of this. It's on the next screen, which I'm not sure if this is going to work, but let's give it a try. There we go. There we go. Okay. So here you see the particles in flux, moving around in this initial orbit that they're set into. And as you can see, the gravitational attraction between them begins to make them collapse. And this system had a great deal of, Will always loves for me to give him sliders, little sliders you could do. So you could change the initial rotation of the system. This rotation is meant to keep it kind of stable so it won't just fall apart right away. I could introduce atmospheric drag. I can introduce different kinds of conservations of momentum so the particle drag particles near them, so it's like an atmosphere and more than a vacuum, and this kind of thing. And here you can see the organization of the octree. As it's moving, these particles are falling into these more densely red regions are where there are more particles and so more octree nodes, and the places where you see fewer red bars, those octree nodes are relatively empty, and this is how we keep the system from completely choking on having to compute hundreds and hundreds of particles. Okay, so this is the kind of thinking that we were initially starting with. Basic physics. It's the basic physics of galactic formation, of solar system formation. We thought we were going to be doing a lot of stuff in outer space with space editing. And so we wanted to begin simulating the fundamental dynamics of space. And with a system like this, we can simulate galactic formation, we can simulate solar systems forming, we can simulate that kind of thing. And we had a lot of fun playing with this particular prototype. Now, moving back. I want to move back. I can't move back. How do I tab over? Control tab, Command tab. Back to. There we go. Okay, now the second prototype that we developed, and unfortunately I don't have a video of this one because my video card wouldn't render this on my new system, is a system called Waterboy. And Waterboy was intended to simulate the behavior of water on a large-scale body like a planet. Okay, and so here we have a little patch of terrain, and we have this system of water. And it was also this is back like in 1997. I'm working on this, and so this was early on in the development of advanced rendering materials control. So this was like our first effort. You can see here at what nowadays is no big deal, but back then was kind of tough to do. Environment mapping, multi-texturing. There's caustics being rendered underneath this terrain, and we were really sort of pushing the edge of what of what video cards could do. Like 13 years ago, when we first started working on this. So you can see here like the reflection of the mountains and things like that. And so the intention of this was twofold. One was to simulate water. Now the water simulation here is based upon a Springfield idea. I'm going to be very brief and quick in the way I describe how these prototypes work. You'll be able to read more about them on the site itself. But basically the idea behind Waterboy is that you simulate water as a big height field, okay, where each neighbor is calculates its offset to its 4 neighbors, right? It's like if I'm below you, then I have a force that attracts me up, and if I'm above you, I have a force that attracts me down. And we put an up-down force and velocity on each of these systems, and then they will settle, and then we put a little drag on the whole thing, so we decelerate them. And then they'll settle out to a flat, placid thing, and then when you disrupt them, they bounce, and they create basically these waves and that look like a large body of water. It's not very good for simulating flow because the samples are all in one place. They don't move around. They only move up and down. So flow looks like it is always in the form of a wave. It's never in the form of water actually physically moving. And so it's not very good for rivers, or waterfalls or things like that, but it's great for lakes and oceans. And we were thinking that we were going to have lots of simulation of like asteroids hitting, the ocean and having a tsunami. This is a great tsunami simulator and that kind of thing. And the second purpose behind this was to, up our ante on what we were going to do graphically. Now, obviously, we ultimately ended up going very far beyond this, but this was one of our initial forays into a 3D graphic system that was not just the fixed pipeline that is provided by OpenGL1. Okay, so that's Waterboy. And you can see our concerns here as we're moving through these early prototypes is what are the fundamental things we're going to try and do? Simulate this kind of science, render these kinds of graphics. Can we demonstrate that it's possible? Is there even a proof of concept of what we're trying to do? You're not going to see much game coming out of these early prototypes. These are the dynamics that we think we're going to want to be playing with. Now, another early prototype was a system called Biome. And Biome, has anybody heard of Conway's Life program? Anyone? Conway's Life? Okay. So Conway's Life is a program that is years old, and it's based on something called cellular automata. And the fundamental idea behind cellular automata is that you have a grid of regular cells. The cell has a state. In Conway's Life, there are 2 states, alive and dead. And then you have rules for how a cell transitions state. And in Conway's Life, it was, I forget the exact rules, but basically if you're surrounded by 3 or more living cells, you die from overcrowding. If you're surrounded by 1 or fewer living cells, you die of loneliness. If you're surrounded by 2 living cells, I think it was 2 or 3, you come to, and you're dead, you come to life out of reproduction. And those simple rules that applied to the grid create these incredibly elaborate patterns. And if anybody has not played around with this, there's 10,000 implementations of it online. It's called Conway's Life. Okay. And so for Spore, I developed a generalization of Conway's Life called Biome, where the rules for a cell transitioning are based on chemical stoichiometry. And so what we would do is this is a case of a forest fire simulator going through a couple of stages. And I have a video of this one too, and this will be more interesting to see. I'm so glad the videos worked. I was so worried about that last night. Here we go, Biome playing. Okay, each state here is either a dead ash, or a fresh young tree, or a dry old tree, right? And then randomly, lightning will strike and create fire, and there are 3 or 4 stages of fire. And every cell that says I am an old dead tree, if I'm near fire, I catch fire. If I'm a young tree and I'm near fire, I catch fire, but with a lower probability. If I'm fire, I move through a series of stages where I go through fire 1, fire 2, fire 3, and then I land on ash. And if I'm ash, I might spontaneously generate a young tree. And so this creates a system that cycles through the production of a massive forest fire. And this is one of our first forays into a principle that we followed in Spore, called emergent dynamics. Okay, so the rules describing this forest fire simulation, and Biome comes, if you get it on the online, it comes with all kinds of really cool different, simulations you can do. 1 second. the emergent dynamics here is that we know we wanted to be able to create things like forest fires and other kinds of systems using very simple rules so that we didn't have to script and control them. Yes?
Is the pattern repeating?
Well, this is a video. No, the pattern will repeat if you no, ultimately no. Probably, mathematically, over a long period of time, but it's based upon, the random behavior is based upon a random number generator. And so you'll repeat if you've landed to the same state with the same random number seed, which I suppose eventually would happen in trillions of years or something like that. Anyway, the emergent dynamics of Conway's life and of cellular automata are the basis for the dynamics in SimCity. So if you ever played SimCity and you've seen the traffic simulation and the growth and decay of all your regions and things like that, that's a cellular automata system as well. And we knew that we were going to want to do this. And what Biome provides you, and the online version lets you actually write your own different simulations, is a fundamental language for describing cellular automata that allowed us to try all kinds of different things, not just forest fires, but also urban dynamics and military territories and all other kinds of things where the rules are governed by how individual agents operate with their neighbors. Okay, moving on. So here in this stage of the prototyping, we're saying what we were thinking was, okay, this is something we're good at. This is something we've done. This is something we have been doing with SimCity. We know this area, but we need to generalize it. We need to start creating languages for it. We've done it in this sort of hard-coded ad hoc way, and we know going into Spore, we're going to want to be very rapid about creating these kinds of simulations. So you can see the fundamental idea when you're prototyping is that you always have a question that you're trying to ask and answer. Okay, you're looking for what is going to block me right now from proceeding to produce Spore the game, right? What do I not know? What do I want to learn? What do I want to see how it behaves? And one of the other systems that we developed for that in that particular order is called Gaslight. And one of the questions that we had was, how good are we on the desktop at simulating cosmic dynamics on a large scale so that they will produce graphics that look like the things we're seeing in the Hubble telescope, right? We're no longer living in an age where I can show you any bullshit I want and call it outer space, right? Because you all, I'm an old man. You guys have grown up not knowing a world where we didn't have a space telescope that was showing us what the cosmos really looked like. And if anybody's ever seen, how many people watched Cosmos? Carl Sagan, have you ever seen Cosmos? I don't know if it's on the Netflixes or the iTubes or whatever, but get out there and check out Cosmos. Fantastic series. But what's really interesting about watching it is how much we've learned since then. How much one of the most brilliant minds in astrophysics didn't know about space, about what space looks like. And he knew more than anybody at the time, really, or he and his peer group, right? And so we understood coming into, we started Spore when those first Eagle Nebula, those Hubble telescope Eagle Nebula photos, when those first came out, that's when Spore started, and we looked at that and said, fuck, well, we can't just paint some silly nebula, people have to see this. So that's what the Gaslight prototype is about. It's about the development of a simulator that simulates the most basic dynamics for the formation of stars at the large scale level, at the galactic nebula and the planetary nebula level. Well, galactic nebula, planetary nebula are small. Okay, so what is Gaslight? Gaslight is a system, and again, this is available for download as well, and you can play with it, that simulates what we call stochastic self-propagating star formation. And this is the dominant theory for how nebulas form in our galaxy, and you can see how the progress of this system will work. And I got another video on this one too. This one's a little bit longer, so I'll run it while I'm talking. Okay, the basic idea behind stochastic self-propagating star formation, which is a theory that's been around for had been around for about 20 years. I guess it's been around for about 30 years now. Is basically this: the galaxy is filled with gas and dust. Okay, and the gas and dust begins to gravitationally collapse. And when it gravitationally collapses in a certain way, we begin to form stars. And what you're seeing here are stars in various different phases. Main sequence stars, like our own sun, are here. They're yellow, and then there are red dwarfs that are forming around as well. Right. And so this system spawns little stars and takes little masses out of itself when it's doing that. Now, stars don't just form in a vacuum, for lack of a better word. What happens is when a star ignites, it begins heating up the gas around it, and the heavier it is, the brighter it is, and the more powerful it is. So the red giants don't contribute a lot of heat to the system, but main sequence stars like our sun do, and then the heavier suns, the ones that are like 20 or 100 times heavier than our star, generate a lot of heat. And that heat pushes against the remaining gas and dust and causes it to begin to move and merge together and crushes it together. So you get more regions of higher density that begin forming more stars, okay? And those regions create more stars that begin igniting and pushing, and those stars are heavier because there's more gas around, and compressing more of the gas until you begin getting a system here that starts to look like the nebulas that we were seeing in the Hubble Space Telescope. Now, this system that we were seeing here starts from random noise. I just filled a nebula with, I just ran a terrain generator that made a big bumpy thing that doesn't look real. And as the system propagates, it eventually gets to a point where the shapes that we see, look like the nebula shapes that we were seeing coming out of the Hubble Space Telescope. And I'm waiting here for us to get to the point where we begin seeing supernovas. There's one that went off, okay? Eventually, stars form that are so heavy that they go nova. And when a nova goes off, it releases a massive amount of heat into the system, as you can see. And that amount of heat clears out whole areas of the nebula. So when you're looking up at the Hubble pictures and you see these holes that have formed in space and these thin membranes, this is the dynamic that produced it. Now, this stuff was just a theory. I just read this paper, and said, well, how did the galaxy form? And I found this theory, right? And I said, well, we better hope that we can simulate that system and get results that look persuasive, because we're in entertainment over here. We're not doing science. This is entertainment, so this better look good, right, if we're going to use this system to generate our nebulas. And lo and behold, after we run it for a long period of time, you can see we begin getting a system that looks very much like a galactic nebula. Now, one of the other fun things that we can do with this system is, because we are a game, and therefore, let me close this up here. Because we are a game and can, give you things that NASA can't give you, we decided to add a little tool to the system to let you play, Fire God in space a little bit, right? And so we added a heat tool here, where you paint through the galaxy with heat, and you see that heat causes this dynamic I'm talking about of compressing the gas around you, and you can shape the nebula yourself. And one of the ideas that we had early on for the game that we didn't end up developing for the game, and maybe someday we'll get in there, is the idea of creating like a galactic paint set. That became a line that we explored for a long time in coming up with the gameplay, is making Spore more like the sim games, like the SimCity games, where you would be painting and crafting things. Now, we ultimately focused that attention more on the planets, and I think that was probably a good idea, because planets are more interesting to a lot of people. But we still always had this idea that you would be painting this galaxy using heat and the other forces of physics to produce these results. Okay, so after Gaslight, we begin, saying, all right, now it's time to start thinking about a game. This was about 5 years of my life. I was working on these prototypes and a few others. And we finally started getting to the point where it's like, okay, we got to start putting this together into a game, right? And I spent a little time on the SimCity team developing a prototype. I don't have really a video for this one because it's pretty straightforward, called Crowd. This one's available online as well, which basically allows you to set down your SimCity zones. SimCity, people are familiar at all with residential, commercial, industrial. So you have yellow, green, and blue for that. And here you have little agents who are little people moving along the street, and there's traffic lights, and then there's cars that get spawned. And this is a basic SimCity traffic simulator that was used to prototype the dynamics for SimCity 4. And the main takeaway from this here is that we had started to move, and again, I know this is something that's been around now for 10 years, and so it's not such a big deal, but back then, we had precious little computer power. We decided we wanted to start moving SimCity in a direction of being an agent-based simulation. SimCity right now, or back then, was as I mentioned, a cellular automata-based system where each cell said, well, I'm a house and you're a store, so let's have commerce, so there's more taxes, hooray. And then, oh, no, you're out of power, so that doesn't work, so that's going to crash, right? And we started to want to have more traffic and people walking around in cars and that kind of cool stuff. And this was one of our first prototypes of saying, can we really have just those dynamics like the SimCity highly programmed rules for neighboring cells and things like that emerge from the behavior of agents walking around. So let's just give agents rules for saying I want to go to work, then I want to go home, and see if we get an economic system out of that. And that's what this prototype was for. I was working on this. I was on the Spore team while I was working on this, but we sort of like subcontracted to the SimCity team. And right up after about this point is when Spore, we began working on our first gameplay prototypes. We had identified all these systems. We said, okay, we have agents. Okay, we have water simulation. We have cellular automata. Okay, we have some what was then advanced graphical systems. This is a game called Tide Pool. This was the first gamic thing to come out of Spore. They have like a light scattering effect there that came out of doing what was our more advanced graphics and what today any child can do. And so here's a little video of Tide Pool. Now, Tide Pool was a game. You can see here I have the Waterboy water simulator. I have this little bird creature, and when he gets into the water, he gets full of water, and he turns blue. And then he's flying over this really simple terrain. And these little green sticks are the forest, like in the Biome forest fire. And you can see they start to turn brown, and they'll eventually catch on fire. And these little yellow guys are the agents, or the critters. And you're supposed to protect them by putting fires out and splashing in the water and dropping water on fire. And the trick with the game is that the more successful you are, the more impossible it becomes. Because the more you keep the forest from burning, the older and older it gets. And the older and older it gets, the more flammable it becomes. And so you have to choose your battles. You have to decide to protect regions in a way that's going to prevent the critters from burning to death, essentially. And this was our first idea of taking the things we had produced thus far over the last several years and putting them together in a way where there's a challenge for the user. That's that's something we hadn't done yet, right? Because we're pretty confident that we could do a challenge for the user. We just need to know what the elements were going to be. Now, this, of course, did not end up representing what the gameplay of Spore was going to be like, and we didn't think it would be. Really, in fact, the most interesting thing here to me was the flight model. I created this nice little flight model for this creature that's really fun to control, and I've done more pleasing versions of this prototype since. But the notion here was to orient our team toward the idea of we're producing a game now. We had been like a research team for a long time. We'd been, going to NASA conferences and reading about self-propagating star formation. It was all this kind of rarefied stuff. And then, of course, you have executive producers who say, you guys are going to make a game out of this, right? And so this was our first element of saying, can we put the things that we've been researching together into something that's compelling, right? And the challenge here that was issued to me and that I kind of wanted to push to was I'd been producing all these other prototypes kind of for Will, and Will just sort of loves to have a little box of sliders and a weird screensaver and some understanding of the dynamics, and he's happy all day. But our exec producer at the time was a guy named Luke Bartholay, who he's the guy who produced The Sims, and he's got this standard that says, I want you to show me something where I want to grab the mouse out of your hand, right? So do something where I'm going to say, no, do it this way. And that's what this was initially intended to get us going in that direction, is to produce a prototype of something that's going to make someone watching you play it want to play it themselves, not just be impressed with what you've done. Okay, so moving on from Tide Pool, this began our series of conversations about what Spore is going to be about. We hadn't really thought it completely through. We knew we wanted to have animals and space. And that's kind of what we had, and we began thinking about what stages of animal development do we want to show, and what theories of space travel do we want to have, and and as you know, we all came up with this multi-level 5-stage thing, but that idea was not, we didn't start with that idea. We came to it through this prototyping process. So after we went into production, we ended up with a team. It's a little bit larger, and we had a little more dedication to making a game. We began to focus on gameplay prototypes that would take us where the designers were taking us. And we now had people on the project designing it, looking at these old prototypes, and saying, well, we want to have an animal level. We want to have a level where you're playing an animal like in the wild. So we know that that's part of the game, so let's start that. And we developed a prototype called Spug. And Spug stands for the Spore Unified Gameplay Prototype. Okay? And basically the idea here was to take a very simple OpenGL world, get a kind of a little creature. No, it's the wrong one. Bear with me. Particle man. It's not what I want to see. SPUG. There we go. So this is Spug. So this is the first game where we produced, a challenge that was driven by the designers. Tidepool was my idea. I went into Tidepool and I said, "Oh, here's all this stuff I've been working on. Here's an idea for a game that you could build with all of it." Okay. This came out of design, and it was the idea of they wanted a creature and they wanted predators and prey, and you have to hide in the trees, and there's tough predators like these red guys who are pursuing me here, who are going to come after me, and they just killed me there. And then there's scared little prey who will run off quickly, and you have to kind of move through this tree, and water-based environment, and just kind of, here I glitched out and died there. And go and get into these combats, and if you kill prey, you get to eat them and stay alive and get some points, and if you get killed, you lose some points. And that was the beginning of this idea of you're playing an actual animal running around the world. And the question we were asking here in the prototyping process was, are the designers developing something? Given everything else we've developed already, are the designers developing something that will ultimately be fun and compelling? The idea behind Spug was to make it so people wanted to play it. It got compelling. Okay, and it actually did get to a point where we were sitting there. It's like, yeah, this is kind of fun. It's challenging. It's difficult. Kind of tuned and balanced. The other questions we were asking was, how are the designers and the developers going to want to communicate in terms of tuning? Because this kind of game is it's very easy to make it not fun. And then it can be very difficult to find the tuning values you need to make it fun. And so what we did was we created a tuning language for this and said, okay, your speed, your consumption rate, the combat, the size of the different flocks that you're doing. The flocking behavior, by the way, that you're seeing here is something called Reynolds flocking. Anybody here Craig Reynolds? Have you named Craig Reynolds? If you're interested in simulating animal behavior, this is on a 2D plane. He's done a lot in 3D as well. If you've ever seen that Boyd's screensaver, that comes with Windows in the Mac, where you have these birds that are flying around, that's based on something called Reynolds flocking. And Reynolds flocking is a system that says you create these individual agents, and all they really do is say, I want to face basically in the same direction as my closest neighbors. I want to be as close. I want to be within a certain range of everybody. I don't want to be too close or too far, and I want to orient toward the leader if I can. And if I'm the leader, I want to orient toward the goal. And that's it. And if you just make little agents that do those write those programs, they will look like they're swimming and flocking and herding and moving like animals do, because that's what animals do. Animals do not have a big plan for how the herd is going to be shaped. What they do is they say, am I too close to you? Am I too far away? Which way are we going? And that's it. Right? So you simulate those things. And that's what we started to do in Crowd with the SimCity simulator. And then we moved that into this. And so the question was, given all of these dynamics, and what the designers are thinking of designing is there a language between the designers and those of us developing these prototypes where we can actually make a game that would be compelling? And this is the beginning kind of we are prototyping our design process with this. Okay. And then ultimately, Spug led to the development of Gonzaga GL, which unfortunately I also don't have a video for this, but you can see some videos of this on YouTube. And again, all of these are available for download. Now, Gonzaga, for those of you who've played Spore, this was the final gameplay prototype we did. And we released to the net is the animal creature level of the game. But by the time we got to Gonzaga, we were fairly clear that we wanted, we knew about the cell game, but we hadn't thought about it too much yet. We wanted creature, tribe, we thought city, civilization, and space. We didn't have too many ideas about space or cell yet, so we left those out. And Gonzaga simulated everything else. All right. What we released to the public is just the creature game, because the other levels of the game were not very stable and not very interesting compared to this one. And this is where we did most of our work. And also just because of production time and things like that, we had to make these prototypes a lot more stable than they were when we were using them in order to release them to the public. But for people who are familiar with Spore, this is the first time you start seeing the elements that actually made it into the final game. This Gonzaga is where we convinced ourselves we had the design, because we have our avatar creature, We have our herds of enemies and prey. We have our home-based nests. We have trees that you can eat at and hide under. We have calling and beckoning behavior. Okay, and we have mating and reproduction. And we have a cycle where your next generation is your child from your previous generation. Okay, and all of the elements that actually ended up becoming into the game came in to Gonzaga. And that brought us from here to here, within a couple years. And without the initial prototypes that we did, without Waterboy, without Crowd, without even Particle Man and all these other things, we never would have gotten to Gonzaga. Because with Gonzaga, to produce Gonzaga, what we had to do is produce a research dynamic between our design team and our engineering team that could produce a result that was expressed by design and implemented by engineering. Okay, and that is what the essence of prototyping is having designers issue ideas and engineers show them to them very, very quickly. And we were able to take this prototype and move forward into the production of the ultimate game. And have some reasonable idea that we're going to have some success without having had to have produced all this art, without having had to produce all this heavy, highly reliable software, huge installs and everything else like that, because we were able to move so rapidly here. If we had to do all of this research in this environment, the framework that we used to develop the final game, we never would have gotten very far. And then, did anybody see Will Wright's original presentation on Spore that he gave to GDC? Has anyone seen that online? That was several years ago when we first issued that. He showed there a prototype that was developed in this environment. Okay, and it was a highly scripted prototype. It was like, this is what we imagine gameplay to be like, but it was basically just an animation system. Because we didn't have the capacity at that point inside of this framework to develop a highly interactive, genuine version of the game, because we were spending a lot of lift on making it look good for this presentation. In the background, we were doing this, but he didn't want to show this at GDC, right? Obviously not very impressive to people. But in this environment, we were able to get a lot of the dynamics in, a lot of the gameplay and the engineering in for the life of the creatures, because it's not a heavy graphical environment, because there's not 10,000 resources, because there's not all this other, it's a very nimble space for changing code, whereas this was a very nimble space for changing art. And then ultimately, when we got into production, we fused these two things together. We brought Gonzaga into our art environment, and that became the basis for the game. And this is what prototyping, the arc of prototyping, is like. Okay, and this is the fundamental experience of being a software engineer in gaming at this point, is developing prototypes with an eye toward a final production platform. That will be your ultimate game. So that's pretty much it. That is the arc of Gonzaga's prototyping. It looks like I have about 5 minutes left. Do we have any questions? Or yes.
In the previous slide where you had a video of your character walking through forest,
Spug?
did you have your biome? Was that your biome?
Was this the Biome Simulator? No. This was just a fixed forest simulation.
Oh.
We never got around to the intent was to make it biome and make it grow, but we found that our fundamental dynamic that we ended up wanting to focus on here was animal to animal, not animal to environment.
And how long did it take on average for some of these prototypes to build?
Well, Spug was very rapid. So basically, Spore. My experience with Spore, I was the first programmer on Spore. I started on Spore at the beginning of the project and followed it all the way through. And we basically were split into two major phases. For about 3 or 4 years, I worked with myself and like 2 or 3 other people. It was a small side project while we were finishing The Sims and a bunch of other stuff. Yeah, and that's when I was doing the cosmic gravitation stuff. And so, those prototypes would typically take me about a week, 2 or 3 days to a week to get the basic thing up. But what you saw there represents years and years and years of playing with it. Right, and so, but those years and years and years, you get diminishing returns on any kind of, so it's like the bulk of what you saw took probably about a month, ultimately to do, I'd say, for these. That was in the phase when I was a very lonely guy. I was sort of, we were doing Sims and SimCity, and Jason's working on something with Will, and I had no resources. Then after the Sims took off, and we were like looking on what to do next, we got a team, because that team basically became available to us, and Spore became a product. Right? And at that point, we started focusing on, well, we have 20 or 30 people. We need them to know what we're doing. And so these prototypes like Spug and Gonzaga were it came up much more quickly because they were part of a production cycle where there was targeted goals. Right before it was just random
You
exploration.
already had like the biome thing.
Here, well, yeah, we had the biome, but also by here it was like we had a design team saying we want a creature game. Whereas with the biome, it was like, Jason, go off and study some stuff about space and science and show me something. Was kind of what I would. So it was a very self-directed. This was very much more externally directed. Gonzaga, I remember more specifically, that was a year's worth of development. This was a couple of months, of development, and this led to Gonzaga. They said we want this on a spherical planet, and with some other stuff that we're talking about. Gonzaga was a team of 5 of us working for about a year, so about 5 man-years went into that one. But these other ones, like if I go back to like Tide Pool, this was just a couple weeks because I had all this together. You can see I didn't do much. I had all the prototypes. I didn't do much, as you can see, with the terrain rendering. Actually, what took most of the time was the flight model and this light scattering effect, because I just started studying light scattering. This was an assignment I had just gotten from Lucy Bradshaw, so I did this in a week. This was like she just needed it quickly. Gaslight, I got the basic. The way the Gaslight simulator works is it's the ideal gas law, from high school. So we have a big set of cells. Every cell has a mass and a temperature, and based on that mass and temperature, I create a flux force between the cells and move mass and move temperature into cells just using PV equals nRT, right? And so that basic simulation took me a couple of weeks to get going, but then tuning it so that it would actually make a nebula appear and not just fly apart or freeze to death, that was tough, and that took me a couple of months. Because this was very rapid because this was just an inspiration, and I'd been working with SimCity for forever. So this took me probably less than a week or two to get that together. Waterboy took a long, long time. The fundamental simulation, again, just a couple of weeks, but for a year I spent studying graphics cards and how to get the render.
Read about water and waves. And
I'd spent a lot of time working on simulations for terraforming Mars for different projects, so I was pretty familiar with water. The fundamental governing equation for water dynamics is something called the Navier-Stokes equation, but that's for non-turbulent flow. That's water moving from place to place. This simulation is completely cheap. It's not real water dynamics. It just looks like water. It's really just a rubber sheet, right? And so, and I'd seen this approach done before, and my idea was go with the rubber sheet because solving Navier-Stokes is a pretty complicated differential equation. And it's also but if you want to do water flowing through a pipe and a waterfall and stuff like that, that's what you need. And then Particle Man, this is another one that I built over years and years. This was the first one I started. Within a couple weeks, within a week, I had the collapsing tree thing working, but all the different dynamics that you can do in this, just got added over the years. One more question? Anybody? Yes, sir.
In this environment, you're working with trying to get the algorithms down.
The formulas, yeah, too.
And I've worked many years ago in a business environment where the algorithms were, already they were given to me.
Right.
Where the prototyping actually involved trying to develop a user interface that was useful for the user. And I'm wondering, right at the end, you talked that once you got all your algorithms down, and now the people added the art to it. And I'm wondering if there are people working on prototyping the art itself.
Yes, of course. And so this is not the complete prototyping environment that happened for Spore. This was my experience of it. And my fundamental part was prototyping the basic dynamics, right? Especially at the beginning. Later on, user interface became more important. The user interface became important to us in Spig and Gonzaga. Those were the two where we started to say, and the user interface should become representative of what we want. And so Gonzaga has a user interface that's very much like what we ended up doing for Spore. It has pie menus and things like that we ended up using. While I was doing this, as I mentioned, back in the, once we went to production, while I was working on this stuff, the art team was developing the more graphical but more highly scripted and less dynamic prototype that Will showed off at GDC. And that's where the questions of things like interface, our look and feel, the overall application flow, how we're going to do transitions, how we're going to control the camera, how all of that was going to work. The one major contribution I kind of did make to interface design in the prototyping phase was a prototype I didn't have here that was like the Tide Pool flight model, but it was much nicer. It was over the spherical planet and looked, the terrain looked better and everything. where we were running into this problem with the avatars. And remember, this is something where, again, I'm speaking to people to whom this is going to seem obvious, but back then we didn't know jack shit about where to put the camera in a computer game. We had no idea. Cameras were awful in computer games in the late 90s. You know, they would bounce into walls, and you had no idea what you're framing, and you always had the avatar framed right in the middle of the screen, so the camera's moving around him and he's standing still, and it looked really cheap. And so I developed this flight system where I said, well, we don't frame the avatar, you frame what the avatar is looking at. So we take this point of view on that like that tide pool creature, and we put it, put a yardstick at the end of his nose, and the camera looks there, so that when he turns, he moves to the frame and exposes more of the frame into the space he's turning in. Okay, and we ended up using that camera in Gonzaga on the ground. I did this in the air, and ultimately we ended up using it in Spore as well. So that when you're turning a corner in Spore and it reveals what's coming around to you, okay, that's a standard camera move these days. It's nothing big, but back then, we were just learning this stuff. That's framing what the guy's looking at. So absolutely, we had user interface concerns on these things, but mostly they came out in the last prototypes in Spig and Gonzaga. For these, there was just, you don't see it in the videos here, but there's just a side little control panel of sliders and buttons and stuff, and that's Will's idea of a user interface. He just loves a big panel of sliders, and so that's what I always give him on these things. So, thank you very much for your kind attention.
And so we went out there.
Did you have projects?
Yeah. So and so on Sunday, so we fed him outside Saturday night. And he stuck around.
Well, thank you, Dr. Overnight. I appreciate that.
And so we thought, well, this is
all right. So
we let him in the house.
I like that on that part.
Oh, he just used to grill.
But I think
Bug.
because there's a number of us that use this format. Yeah, I think what it is so you run it down. Hopefully, I know Zach, Matt, and Tom, we all did apply that way. So we emailed them and obviously. The way I thought it, N was the number of big shoes in R,
until later, or after class. Okay. Yeah, I don't think. Then once we need for like homework or anything. What was your name? Ronnie? Jesus, yeah. Yeah, that's what I was like. Okay.
There's actually a lot of people just going around. I know. We did that in all sports. What's usually? As you told you, all the girls go.
I love it though. Like, I mean, everyone always complains like while they're there. Especially the uniforms.
But it always
Well, anyway, I wanted to. That wasn't bad. Do you have to take exams? Yeah.
So I don't know that.
Yeah, it's just a lot of memories.
Oh, in long run. What?
There's so much information.
Next week.
Chem's probably harder than it's more like concepts. Now, whereas you're in the bed, memorize it. And then try to get yeah. And go to class. So it's just kind of I guess it's yeah, you can. I mean, you can graduate in like 5 years.
I don't know. Kristen, now right?
Yeah, super thankful.
What?
There's like she's like a 7 freshman year. They're wearing like she got a full right here and she just mega dances. You know her?
Yeah.
She's quite
Yeah, I think it's doing better.
Name tag?
you know what?
One of the seniors like on her first thing that happened at the party.
I knew it. I knew she would.
You didn't hear from me.
Yeah. I knew she wouldn't quit just
Yeah.
to quit. Like her boyfriend asked him, he's like, yeah, it's not my place to say, but like she just roll it in JC and then come back soul patch. Eat like somebody can drop a reset.
Just make sure you wake up. Okay. So let's see, where did we start? Okay, so today we are going to finish our discussion of chapter 10. So we'll probably start talking about money, so chapter 13 on Tuesday. Remember, you have an assignment due on Tuesday on this chapter just to make sure you get one more practice before the exam, which is a week from today. Practice exam is online, so it's going to be on the end of chapter 9. Is it 9? Yeah. And on chapter 10, and if we do a bit on money, just some basic stuff about what is money, what do we use money for. So that's just a handout I made for class today. So last time I think we just stopped setting up the model. So I haven't put all the lines together. Do you have any questions before I start? No? Okay, so before we put them all together, just briefly. So if I ask you to draw an aggregate demand, how do you draw it and why? Bethany? Well, it's going to be downward sloping, right? So that's, the wealth effect, interest rate effect, the international effect, and the multiplier effect. So that's why whenever we have an increase in the price level, on average, our demand for goods and services tend to decrease. So that's for the demand side. Now, why on the supply side do I distinguish the short run from the long run? What assumptions do I make in the model that basically implies that the supply is